Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Family Matters for tonight. We're going to be talking to Jonathan Bowen tonight, all the way from Canada, and we're going to be talking about gaming. Now, times have moved on since the Space Invaders and the Pac-Man of the 1980s. Now, instead of spending time with 20-cent computer games in an arcade or the local fish and chip shop, it takes place in the privacy of your own home on your own device, whenever and wherever you want. Games in the 2020s are much more graphic, realistic, violent, and addictive. Today's gaming is not restricted to teenage boys with nothing else to do. Instead, it affects all of us, males, females of all ages. Now, Jonathan tonight is going to share some gaming statistics with us, and as well as some principles to help keep us and our loved ones keeping our priorities right. So welcome, Jonathan. It's really good to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here.
Just before we begin, let's do a quick Bible reading. And we're going to do that from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. And this is what it says. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. The other one I'd really like to share with you tonight is Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. So thanks for joining us, Jonathan. We're talking about gaming. What are we talking about when we're talking about gaming?
So basically, as you mentioned at the very beginning, things have changed drastically from when I was a boy, and it was what they called Pong, Atari Pong, where there was two little, things that went backwards and forwards, and some little blip moved across the screen. It's a massive industry today. According to the stats of one of the gaming companies, actually, I printed off their little brochure. This is their facts for 2021. I last looked at it in 2019, but with the whole coming of COVID, it's ballooned. But now it's reckoned about 2.5 billion people around the world play video games, and that's pretty much 31% of the entire world's population. So it's
is that playing regularly? Is that playing games regularly?
Playing regularly, yes. So the idea is it's the stats they give is about 55% of males, 45% of females, which blew me away. I thought it'd be more guys than girls, so to speak, but it's not. It's almost an even split between who is playing video games, and it's everything from simple games like Tetris, which is how I learned how to pack the family car, putting little boxes in sort of little spaces, right up to extremely extravagant air flight simulators, driving games, lots of sports games, but especially a lot of what they call first-person shooter games, which are active, you're right in the scene of some army going into war or whatever it might be. And it really crosses the gamut. There's a whole whack of different types of games that people are getting engaged in.
So it's not the realm of young teenage boys anymore. It's got everyone, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's really, it's ridiculous in a way how fast it has grown. In fact, it has replaced movies as the leading form of entertainment, which I was amazed to actually realize. But it's absolutely huge. 70% of parents say that basically they play video games with their children, and the hours that are spent is about 50% of people playing games are playing more than 7 hours a week. So that's like almost an entire work day's worth of time. But some, it's a heck of a lot more than even that. But it's 20, like 30% is at least 3 hours, 77%, 3+ hours, but 51% more than 7 hours a week. And it covers really, every age group. I thought it was more of a teenage thing. It's actually 18 to 34 is the biggest age bracket. So what they call the millennials, that's the biggest age bracket in gaming, and it's huge. But it also goes up those sort of 34 to 35, 45 to 54. Like the way it breaks it down, there's a lot of people that are involved in playing games.
So what do you see as being the problem with games, video games?
Well, when you look at the statistics, and I pulled this off the other night just to kind of get my head around, what the industry says. So these are the people that advocate it, right? So these aren't your nutty Christians who are saying that this isn't something we should do. These are the people saying, rah rah, sis boom bar, this is the best thing ever. And they even come out and say that in the age groups, it's about a 50% of people that are playing games are playing either action games or first-person shooter games. So they are, I should say, actually, it's pretty much, and that's for the first from 18 to 44. It's about 50% is the really violent type of video games. But they're also very much available to youngsters as well. And kids are brilliant, just try and, I remember, my dad couldn't sort of set the time on the microwave, when we got a microwave, it flashed 12 o'clock forever. And as parents, we tend to be a bit that way where we just can't be bothered with some of the technology. So the kids can very quickly find their way around it. And a lot of younger kids are playing some very violent games, but not just that, just heavily addictive games. It's the endorphin rush that the brain gets, and there's all kinds of studies on that as well. It's right up there with cocaine, with sugar for a diabetic, that sort of like extreme must-have. It's the same thing with video games, that it really is an addictive type of activity.
Yeah.
So what do we see that might sort of, the role or knock-on effect that might happen for people who are engaged in perhaps the more violent games?
So it's not just the violent games. One of the things that they talk about is the lack of empathy that basically gets developed. And these are the eggheads in their conversations, right? So they talk about the fact that people get detached from society. They get very insular. They don't like to communicate with people. It's bad enough with, teenagers, when you get a text message from somebody on the other side of the house. And I would say to my kids, don't you dare ever text me in my own house. Like, that's not going to happen. That's the way, younger people tend to be. They'd rather text than facially connect. And that's one of the big things that's coming out of this is a disconnection from society. And of course, COVID didn't help because everything went to Zoom and all this kind of stuff. But what's developed during that time is a real case of addiction. A lot of young people, and I say young adults. I go back to even when I was a factory manager. And I would have my production team that worked under me come in, and they would be blurry-eyed and I thought they'd all been out at the pub the night before, but they'd actually all been playing games together till 4 o'clock in the morning. So it went on all night, and they would come to work groggy and all this kind of stuff. And that's the world, but that is becoming a huge issue even within our ecclesias, is a lot of young people engaged in playing games for multitudes of hours. And it just has become something that's really, all engrossing.
If we can get back to the war games, and action games, one of the things that we've been discussing in New Zealand lately is military service. How would that go down if we were facing a military tribunal, and I turn up and I've been playing some sort of war game, first person shooting sort of game for 15 hours a week, what would that do to my monetary tribunal appeal?
Well, if you go back to the last war where Christadelphians in North America, I could use an example, was the Vietnam War. One of the things that they were asked questions about was violent sports like football, rugby, whatever it might be. That was actually one of the things that got brought up. And of course, well, I'm not killing anybody. I'm actually, engaged in a game, and I'm playing. Now, and it's a team and it's, we're playing rugby and all this kind of stuff, or football or whatever it might be. Now you take that to today and say, well, actually, I'm on a team, but we're running around pretending we're soldiers, we're shooting people, that kind of stuff. It really takes the conscientious part of conscientious objector and tosses it out the window. Conscientiousness is defined as, wishing to do something that's right, or somebody's duty thoroughly. Governed by our consciences, right? Whereas when you look at this, how can you say that this is, the scriptures say, turn the other cheek, all the verses that we would use, thou shalt not kill, all that kind of stuff, when we are actively engaged in entertainment with it. And you could say the same thing, for watching violent movies, binge watching Netflix or whatever it might be. I'm not saying that one's worse than the other. It's the same type of thing I think that we'd run into. But what's interesting is that the US Army has actually been using video games as its most effective recruiter, as what they do. So they have big transport lorries that will go to colleges, universities, high schools, and they invite young people in and they play the video games, and they actually have US Army esport teams, where the soldiers are paid full time to play video games all day long, and basically get online and chat with young people as young as 12 years old and invite them to enroll and enlist and basically work towards a career in the military. So they're using it. In fact, some of the first Puritan shooter video games, there's one called America's Army, was actually made by the US military for this purpose. So it's really crossing that line into, you really don't have a shred of hope to say, I'm a conscientious objector when you're spending your time enjoying warfare, right? That's your entertainment.
Yeah. So what if I said, just to put the cat among the pigeons, oh, but it's just pretend?
Well, I would say there, I would look at Matthew, right? So if we went into what the Lord says, I'd say the principle of Matthew 5 here, and we look at verse 28, the scripture says, you've heard in old time, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And he uses the same thing of violence as well. Here's the point, is that basically, vicariously participating in adultery is equivalent to actually doing it. When it comes to violence, enjoyment in violence, as far as God is concerned, is basically equivalent to being involved in it. And you think about this, these are lusts of the flesh. Like violence is a lust of the flesh. Think of James, I think it's chapter 4, where he talks about, wars and fightings among you. Where do they come from? They come from your flesh, from your passion. So even when we get in arguments and battles amongst ourselves, it's our flesh that is basically displaying its characteristics. Violence is something the flesh enjoys. So, I would like a good action movie. I'm not interested in a romance. That would be more the kind of thing that I would enjoy, because flesh enjoys that kind of thing. Now, the real question is, what does God think about it?
And do you think that it's so much easier to blur the lines between reality and pretend when you engage in things that really, I guess, make it seem more real in our minds like that?
I think, like, more and more it becomes, there's definitely a blurring of reality, because a lot of young people a lot of their time is spent online. In fact, there's whole e-worlds where you can go and buy apartments that don't actually exist. They're just in the internet world, and people live in that world, and they have businesses and sell things, and they have vehicles that they can, if you want to drive a Lamborghini, if you want to look like this, if you want to, hang around with whoever, you can create this whole aura for yourself that doesn't really exist. And it's really escapism is what it is. And one of the articles I was reading is saying that, video game escapism is on a par with alcohol and drugs. It's basically feeding that endorphin rush. It's creating an escape from reality. My life, I don't like my life. I don't like the fact that I live where I live, that I'm poor, or my circle of friends is small. So I can go online and I can become whatever I want to be. And, I can feed those lusts of, having pride and, it could be covetousness. I've got all this stuff. And the same is true even within video games. It's the whole idea of you're with a team and you're working with them, and your persona is, your stats of what you've done, and people look up to you, and it all kind of feeds that kind of thing, and it becomes reality. As it's called, virtual reality. And that's what it becomes for a lot of people.
Right.
Over lockdown, a lot of, obviously we haven't been able to get together as CYCs or ecclesias or anything like that. So I know that a lot of young people have started gaming together,
Yes.
and calling it fellowship time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we have that anomaly over here as well. It's not really an anomaly anymore. It's quite a common thing. And in fact, it's not just young people. It's brethren with their kids, with the CYC. We've seen that, people have talked about that quite a bit. And my answer to that would really be, like, what is fellowship? If we went into 1st of John, chapter 1, he says there in verse 6, if we say we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his son, cleanses us from all sin. So fellowship is walking in the light, and walking in the light is how we have fellowship with one another. So we might be spending time one with another, but we're not having fellowship in the sense of around the word. We might be chatting and talking and stuff like that. But when you compare what the scriptures have to say about this idea in Ephesians 5, we have that whole thing there about being separate from the world and uncleanness, let it not be named amongst the saints and things like that. But if you come down to verse 6, and I think this kind of speaks to this, where he says, let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things comes the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. And that's all the things he's just named off that he says don't participate in. And then he says, let no man deceive you with vain words. So quite often when he says, let no man deceive you, it means that chances are we're being deceived. So he says, do not be partakers with them in verse 7, because you were darkness, but now you're supposed to be light. Walk as children of the light. And in verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So to me, when we make that statement, if we're having fellowship by playing, let's say, a violent video game, my question would be, well, would the Lord Jesus Christ join us in this? And my grandmother, my great-grandmother actually used to say, Psalm 1, blessed is he that sitteth not in the seat of the scornful. And that's why she would never be caught dead in a movie theater, right? So I'm not going to sit in the seat of the scornful. She just simply took that at face value. But for us, like if we were to say, okay, we're having fellowship, fellowship is first with the Father and the Son. So would they participate with us in this? And of course, the answer is absolutely not. They wouldn't want a bar of it. In fact, Kingdom Age, this is going to get taken away. So why would we want to engage in this now? In fact, just think about this. It is Revelation 22, right? So right at the very end, he says, look, who's going to be in the kingdom? Verse 14, blessed are they that do his commandments, and they may have right to the tree of life and enter in through the gates of the city. Okay. But who's not there? Without our dogs, sorcerers, whoremongers, murderers, idolaters, and those who love and make a lie. So you've got whoremongers and murderers. So in a way, you could say pornography and the love of all those types of things, which, you know, is a real struggle, is kind of on a par with this violence, right? It's sort of a similar thing, because pornography, you could argue, well, I'm not, you know, doing anything. I'm not, you know, with anybody or whatever, so therefore it's okay, you know. But going back to that principle that the Lord brought up, if we're doing this in our minds or in our hearts, we may as well be doing it. So it's kind of on a par, and we don't often think of it that way. We think of it as, oh, it's no problem, you know, it's not hurting anybody, it's not real, you know. But again, the question has to be, what does God think of it? And that's the part that our conscience doesn't want to hear, right? So, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I'm not standing here saying I'm better than anybody. Like, I'm not. I mean, we struggle with these things over here. That's why we're having this conversation, because, you know, these are things that are in our families, they're in our ecclesias, they're in our society all around us, and we all struggle with different things. I might not struggle with gaming. You know, that might not be for me the issue, but it might be Netflix or movies or whatever it might be. It's really all the same thing. And it's learning to see it as God sees it. So when we say, well, we're not really hurting somebody, you actually, who you are hurting is yourself, right? Because you're making an impression on your mind that is really difficult to get out of thinking. And I just want to share two verses in the Psalms that I found super helpful, just for myself, even in sort of, you know, you go through lockdown and it's like, well, what are you going to do with your time? Well, it's very easy to get a subscription to Netflix and just binge watch goodness knows what for hours. And it might be something totally benign, science, whatever, you know, like, you know, ecology, you name it, penguins and stuff like that. But it's what we got to be careful of is that we are supposed to be redeeming the time. But when it comes to the violence, Psalm 11 and verse 5, it says that the Lord tries the righteous, but the wicked and him that loves violence, his soul hates. And that one was kind of like a gong to me. Because like I said, like if you were to say, what kind of, you know, movie would you like to watch? You know, you've got three choices. Mine would be the action one, because that's more what feeds my flesh. Wouldn't be my wife's thing, but that would be mine. But why? Well, because my soul, the flesh in me, and out of the heart, it's there that the things come from that defile a man. It loves violence. Well, God says, him that loves violence, my soul hates. So I've got to learn not to be involved in those things. I've got to learn to wean myself off of it.
But what about if you know, if the gaming you're doing or what you're watching or whatever is not really of a violent nature? Where does that sort of stand in this discussion?
So you start looking at the different games, right? So what genres are they? Let's say you've got something called The Sims, right, which is about building a little life. You know, it's not violent at all. You're going to build a house, and then you're going to build a city, and then you're going to add this and that and the other. And really, what it is all about is covetousness, hoarding of stuff, right? So it's all about bigger, better barns, and I've got this car and that car, and it's all amassing of all this kind of things. And it's covetousness. So that's the one side of it. But all of them kind of play to the characteristic of pride. You know, I'm number one. Whatever the game might be, I'm number one. I've squashed all these other people to get to this place. It's king of the hill. You know, it's like, you know, playground bully kind of, but the ability to do it in an electronic environment. So it's that side of it where it's feeding the flesh. But it's more than that, it's redeeming the time. And we are bought with a price, and we're supposed to be redeeming the time. And when we think about what do we do with our minds? If we just go to Romans 8, and this is stuff that we're familiar with the wording of, but we don't always think of it in terms of the practical things in our lives. But I'm going to read it from the ESV. It's a little easier to understand. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace. The mind that is set on flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. So you say, okay, a lot of these other types of videos, they might not be violent, but what are they? What shall we eat? What shall we drink? Wherewithal shall we be clothed? Bigger and better barns. It's all feeding the flesh on one level or another. And if all we're doing is stuffing that kind of stuff into our minds are just set on the things of the flesh. And it's not feeding the man of the spirit, whereas we're supposed to be redeeming the time. And so you think of Philippians chapter 4, and this is, and these are like, poster verses, stick them on the wall, and sometimes we like to do that, but like we got to sit there and think, well, this actually has to impact my life. So Philippians 4, whatsoever is, he says, the peace of God that passes all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus, verse 7. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of good report, if there's any virtue and if there's any praise, think on these things. That's what we've got to get our minds into. Those things which you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. And that's really the key, is getting our minds into that, because the reverse of this is what he talks about in Matthew. And this is really, and this speaks to all of it. It's not just video games, it's the whole world's entertainment, genre, whatever it might be for us, which, it's becoming video games more and more. It's taken over most of the entertainment world. And in Matthew 22, he says, look, and again, this is, I think, the ESV, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body is going to be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body is full of darkness. And if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? So we have that little Sunday school hymn, be careful, little eyes, what you see, right? So that's the thing, is that if our eye is healthy, and what we put into our heads is healthy. And I don't just mean bland. It's not like we're going to eat tofu or something that just has nothing to it. It's about nutrition, right? So it's spiritual nutrition, what we're putting in. Because if all we do is feed it junk food, so to speak, where it's easy, it's fun, it's like, it's like going to McDonald's. It's great for the first 5 minutes, and then you have indigestion for the rest of the day, So it's sort of that sort of thing. But in 2 Corinthians 4, he says there in verse 3, and he's talking about preaching the truth to people. He says, look, if our gospel is hid, it's hid to those that are lost, in whom the God of this world has blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. So what we can do is cause our eyes to glaze over. We can't see anymore. Our eyes become dark, and our minds are blinded to the light of the glorious gospel. So that's the biggest, I think, challenge, is that if we spend all our time doing this, it's really a tough thing to get spiritual nourishment.
So what would you suggest as the flip side to this, of how we can, build ourselves up in a way that connects with God and that gives God glory, but also is something that we want to be able to do? Because sometimes, it can just seem a bit hard. The God's ways can seem a bit, sometimes it's far less appealing to do that than to turn on the computer and play a game.
Oh, yeah. And you see that, I mean, really, like, one of the things I think has to be first of all, recognizing this is a problem. I would say that that's probably the first port of call, is to recognize it's a problem, like Psalm 51, which applies on so many levels, where the psalmist basically says, David says, I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee and thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mayest be justified. Now, acknowledging our sin to God, why do we even need to do it? He already knows. It's not about him knowing, it's about us coming to terms with that. And so it becomes then, and the Lord says in Luke, pray that you enter not into temptation. And it's really about developing a taste for the things of the truth. So if you look at Romans 12, and the 9th verse says here, like, here's what Paul says. He says, and this is a tough one, right, for our flesh. Let love be without dissimulation, abhor that which is evil, and cleave to that which is good. Now that's easily said. It's an easy memory verse, right? But that's what our flesh finds really tough, is abhorring that which is evil and cleaving to the good. So when I look at that, I think, and I used to say it as a young man, I used to think, how do we develop the desire, right? Because it's so easy to desire the things of the flesh, whether that's, movies, video games, pornography, all those things, they're fleshly lusts that our body wants. It wants us to feed it. And so looking at the Lord and saying, well, how the heck did he do it? Because, he was also made of the same stuff. And there's this little phrase in one of the Emmanuel prophecies in Isaiah 7. And it's the one where the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you're going to call his name Emmanuel. And that's Isaiah 7, verse 14. But then there's this little cryptic phrase, butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. And I read that and I thought, well, that's the answer to abhorring evil and choosing good. It's actually a phrase that Paul has quoted, cleaving to that which is good and abhorring that which is evil. It's coming right out of this passage in Isaiah. So I used to think, well, what on earth does that mean? I mean, I'm sure a diet of butter and honey isn't really going to do you that much good. You're going to clog your arteries and get diabetes, right? So it's sort of like there's obviously more to this. And so you start thinking about it and you think of, well, there's the milk of the word, right? Desire the milk of the word that you may grow thereby. And the word is sweet. Thy word is sweeter than honey in the honeycomb. But it's actually a step further than that. It's the desire of the promises. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. So when you think of the Lord Jesus Christ and his greatest trials and temptations, so if you go to Hebrews 12, so you think of the cross, which is kind of the culmination of all of his temptations through all his life. So in Hebrews chapter 12, and you have him there, and we're told there to look unto Jesus, verse 2, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. So he had developed a taste for the kingdom of God, developed a taste for the promises. And so I would say, like, that's one of the areas that we really need to work on is getting that taste. It's not something that is natural. I mean, I found out years ago I was diabetic, right? So I love my Coca-Cola, and I love my chocolate bars and whatever else. But went to the doctor and he said, look, kid, this is going to kill you. You need to start making, now you can either just take the drugs and then eventually they'll stop working and you'll end up on dialysis, or you can change your lifestyle. And so I was like, well, I don't really want to die. Not yet anyway. So I had to learn to change my appetite. So things that I thought were gross, as a kid, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, stuff like that, I just thought they were hideous. As I weaned myself off the sugar, Or actually, I kind of went cold turkey, as that's it, you know, and like I had these massive migraines and withdrawal symptoms and whatever. But I was motivated, right? But as I weaned myself off the sugar, all of a sudden, all this other stuff started to taste good because I was no longer fooling my brain with false messages. So I stopped drinking the soft drinks. I stopped drinking or eating the chocolate. I stopped, you know, all the stuff that was, you know, and I probably lost, I think, 80 pounds altogether during the
Wow.
process. But like, I had to learn to desire something else. And that, I think, is one of the keys, is basically that idea of setting your mind on the things of the spirit. You've got to learn to desire, and that's a process, just like changing your diet is. You know, you've got to replace it with other stuff.
Mm. So I've known a few couples whose marriages have eventually broken up because one partner is spending all their day gaming.
Yeah.
You got any advice or any thoughts, quick thoughts on what the non-gaming partner can do about that? You know, or you know, any advice for them?
So I would say the first thing is to recognize that we're all flesh, right? So you can't come at this from a condemning, you know, holier than thou, you're going down this road sort of point of view. What we've got to do is recognize, like it says in Peter, we are heirs together of the grace of life, right? So we're in this together. And unlike the world, we're not roommates, we're husband and wife. And, you know, we are both supposed to help each other. And one of the first things is like it says in James, confess your faults one to another. Have an honest conversation about it. That's really where it has to start, is like, you know, how can we help each other to that? And it could be a husband, it could be a wife, it could be the wife addicted to Pinterest and Facebook, and all she does is, you know, goes through all that stuff. It's the same thing. If you just look at Ephesians 5, so this is where the husbands have a responsibility to make sure their wives are exposed to what I'm going to call the WWW. Now, it's not the World Wide Web of iniquity, it's something else. And it's, you know, we know it. Husbands, love your wives. Ephesians 5:23, as Christ loved the ecclesia, right? Washing it with the water of the word. So there's your WWW, right? So we've got to get the word back into our relationship somehow. And that I think is one of the key things. So when a husband and wife run into this, and the same is true, like for the wife, she is an help meet or fit for him. And sometimes he may struggle, and there might be struggles, and the wife has to realize her job as his sister is to help him get to the kingdom. His job as her husband is to help her get to the kingdom. And it can't be a he said, she said, I'm better than you, you know, tit for tat like the world likes to get into. It's got to be, how can we reform our entire lives? Now, the question might be, so if you're spending all this time gaming, what are you not doing? You know, are you going to the Bible class? Are you doing your readings together? And so one of the things, when Charlene and I were first married, we read The Life of Robert Roberts. We were like, okay, if you're going to live together in the truth, we should look at, you know, how did some of our brethren live? And we read The Life of Robert Roberts together, just to kind of get an idea of what was it like for them back then. But reading a book together, The Life of Christ by Melba Purkis. There's short little chapters. You know, it's not like you need to read a ton, but basically activities together, listening to classes together, doing the Bible readings together, and really getting involved, like junior CYC, redeeming the time together so that you're now meshed together again in the Word, rather than drifting apart into two totally separate lives that become, you know, people say we've grown apart. Like, what a load of rubbish. I mean, that's just choices, a series of choices you've made. You haven't grown apart, you've decided yourselves apart. And that's where we need to kind of take stock of it and turn it around.
In our previous chat, Jonathan, you shared with us an initiative that you had going on over there with some of the young people. And I just found that really encouraging, because I felt like that was a really positive way to get people engaged and involved in extended ecclesial life in a way that really fills them up and gives them a sense of purpose and hope. And can you share that with us?
Sure. So I think like one of the challenges coming out of COVID has been, a lot of our young people feel disconnected, right? They feel disconnected from the ecclesia. They feel like don't necessarily have a role so much. They might be out of CYC age, but not really fully engaged in ecclesial life. They might not have kids yet or whatever it might be. So we have a group of young people here that kind of fit that mold. So what we sort of thought was, well, one of the best ways, and this is the same with a young husband and wife as well, the best ways of doing of sorting this is really comes out of Romans. So this is kind of the emphasis for it. It's this idea of how do we displace all of these things that are not necessarily so good. So it's Romans 8 and verse 13. He says, don't yield yourselves members or your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but yield yourselves to God as those who are alive from the dead, as instruments of righteousness unto God, right? So this is the thing, that we can't let sin reign in our mortal bodies, right? So that's what he says previously. But the idea is that we have to mortify the deeds of the body through the flesh. I was reading chapter 6 over in 8. That was the other one, 8 verse 13. If you live after the flesh, you shall die. But if you through the Spirit mortify the deeds of the body, you shall live. So the idea is engagement, right? So we said, okay, we need to look at our ecclesia and say, how can we serve, right? What can we do? So the thought was, we have quite a few brothers and sisters, elderly, living a ways from the ecclesia. They might be an hour and a half. So bring the ecclesia to them. So let's put together a little band of brothers and sisters who, are then able to say, okay, brother so-and-so, let's work on an exhortation, let's work on how to do prayers, let's work on reading, not mutual improvement in the beat somebody over the head kind of way, but in the sense of how do we put a talk together? How do we do these things? And then take it out to areas of the ecclesial world that maybe don't have the benefit of the fellowship we have, and have those young brothers and sisters run the little meeting where there's going to be, maybe there's a piano and one of them can play, or maybe we do tapes. I mean, that's a right. Well, I'm dating myself now, an MP3 player or something or whatever. But we can sing. There's enough of us, and maybe they've missed that. Zoom singing is pretty awful. So you can actually do that together, and take that study to them, but get into the Word so that we're mortifying the flesh through the Spirit. And it could be like a little group where we say, all right, friend at work, friend at school, they asked about this idea, the rapture. Okay, as a group, rather than gaming online now, let's get together and study online and figure out how are we going to answer those questions. What is the arsenal of verses that we can use with the goal of winning that person, not winning the game, right? And just totally change our focus, and pray to God for the opportunities, because they will come. I mean, he does do that with us. He will give us opportunities in our lives.
Yeah. So you were sharing with us that these initiatives that you're doing was creating real excitement amongst the young people, and that they were really enjoying this.
Yes, yeah, it's really been a I would say something that the engagement, it's a feeling of purpose. Like I've got a job to do. We're going to go down to these brother and sister here and brother and sister there. They're super excited to see them. It's a small enough scale that they're not intimidated. You know what I mean? Like, so that we can do this and feel like you are serving. I'm now in use in the ecclesia. Because sometimes that's what can happen, is we feel like we just don't belong. And so we find solace in other areas, and COVID has really not helped that. I mean, it's been a challenge for sure, but the excitement now of being able to serve, I mean, and that's something that really is gratifying, way more when you go down and you help a brother and sister out than it is, you know, playing online for 5 minutes or 5 hours or whatever, and then that's gone. Whereas that relationship building is going to last.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We've really enjoyed it tonight. It's been a real eye opener. Just, you know, well, from the statistics to seeing what the Bible has to say about it, and your personal advice for people who are going through those struggles. It's been really, really great. So thank you so much for that.